All right. Well, we are 2 minutes after the hour here. So I think we can get started. And as folks join, uh, they can jump in. My name is Caroline Carlson. I am the digital editor here at the Daily Yonder. And I'm really pleased to be able to host this journalism collective. It's an experiment that we've been doing to bring folks who are journalists, folks who are interested in journalism and in rural issues together. And I'm even more pleased to be joined by three excellent journalists and colleagues. I'm going to call on each of you so you can introduce yourself, and I'll just go in order on my screen. Tom, do you want to say hi?
Hello, everyone. Hi, I am Tom Philpott, and I was a journalist for more than 20 years. I worked at most recently at Grist magazine and Mother Jones magazine, covering food politics. And I am now still doing freelance journalism from a position of research associate at the Center for a Livable Future at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Chris, do you want to say hi?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chris Clayton. I am the ag policy editor for DTN, the Progressive Farmer. And this is now my 30th year as a journalist. I graduated in 1993 with a journalism degree. And before focusing on agriculture, I worked in newspapers in the Midwest. So it's been a long run, I guess. And I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Chris. Last but not least, my own coworker, Claire. You want to say hi?
Hello, everybody. My internet is being a little spotty, so if you see me pause, I apologize. Yes, my name is Claire Carlson. I am a staff writer at Daily Yonder. I've been here about 1.5 years now, covering the environment, but more specifically food and agriculture issues as they relate to rural communities. Prior to the Daily Yonder, I freelanced for several publications based in the West. I've spent all of my time in the Western United States, both learning and reporting on environmental issues that affect a lot of rural places in this region of the country. And I haven't been in this as long as Chris or Tom, so I'm excited to hear from you both as well, but very pleased to be on this panel.
Yeah, we're pleased to have all of you, and I do try to represent, sort of a breadth of folks in the industry here, and I think it's great, great to have some seasoned folks and some newer folks, and I'm a little bit in the middle here. So, as I alluded, we'll get started with a conversation between the panelists, and then later on open it up for questions. And I can call on my fellow panelists here, or you can jump in as you're able. My first question is, how did you end up writing about food and ag? Is it an interest that you've always had, or a happy coincidence? Who wants to get started? Or I can call on you. Chris?
Sure. Well, I was working at the Omaha World Herald, which is just down the road from where I live, more or less, about 20 minutes from Omaha, Nebraska. And I was, quote, our Iowa reporter. And as our Iowa reporter, I got to be the guy, this was in the late 90s, who covered all the politicians who came into Iowa, but I covered everything under the sun, whether it was a murder case or a feature, whatever was going on. I had an entire state to myself. In 2001, I kind of stumbled upon a cattle fraud case, purely by accident. And when I initially found out about it, I just didn't realize just how big a deal it was. But it was essentially a couple $100 million involved. It was a Ponzi scheme with a feed yard. And I had to learn a great deal about, how the cattle industry operated. And when the FBI finally had the indictments on this gentleman and his bookkeeper, they said it was, at the time, the largest cattle fraud in U.S. history. And it was a very complicated situation. Next thing I know, I'm the agriculture reporter for the World Herald. So instead of in Iowa, I'm heading and covering things in Western Nebraska. And I got tired, though, of, the newspaper industry. Besides struggling, there's a, great deal of emphasis on sports. I kind of got tired of competing with the Nebraska Cornhusker football team for a travel budget. And it turns out that there was an agricultural news organization in Omaha called DTN. And at the time, they had hired an editor who had worked at the Wall Street Journal for 20 years to come in and build a newsroom. And so I was very intrigued and interested in working for Urban Lehner was his name. And he recently retired from us, but I was very attracted to the idea of working for this guy who left the Wall Street Journal to come work at a small ag news organization out of Omaha. And then after that, DTN bought the magazine, The Progressive Farmer, which has been around since the 1880s. And so we have offices in Omaha, Nebraska, but also Birmingham, Alabama. And then Caroline, we have our mothership, as I call it, is in Burnsville, Minnesota. So really since 2005, I've been working primarily for this, business to business, more or less publication focus, writing directly for commodity producers.
Very cool. Very cool. Claire, do you want to go next? Why are you writing about food and ag?
Well, I feel like I kind of stumbled into journalism a little bit before getting serious about this field. About 2 years ago, I was doing a master's degree in environmental studies at the University of Montana. And while I was there, I was working on a farm that is funded through the school. I was also learning a lot about food issues. And I realized that it's a topic that's extremely personal, but also it's one in relation to the environment that really affects everybody at a certain, to a certain degree, some more closely than others. But I found that really interested me. And then when I started, pitching to different places, it felt like it was always coming back to agriculture for me. So many of the places that I was wanting to report on had some really interesting agriculture stories and also issues. And then when I started working at the Daily Yonder, which is a rural focused newsroom, it felt pretty natural to start pursuing ag stories because, as all of us know, rural communities are pretty closely tied to agriculture. Not all of them, of course, but many of them. And that kind of became a natural beat for me. And I found myself also surprisingly interested in the economics behind agriculture and some of the issues within this industry right now, just kind of the enormous players in this field and the fact that there are only, there are a few corporations that really control wide parts of the sector. So I have been doing a lot of reporting related to that, and then also just meeting and speaking to farmers. It's one of my favorite field reporting activities. So it just, I don't know, it felt natural to pursue this, and it really, I think, fit well with what the Daily Yonder has been wanting to report on.
Absolutely. Tom?
Well, yeah, I came at it from a pretty circuitous route. I got my start in journalism in the mid '90s at a English language newspaper in Mexico City, and I had done some journalism in college. And when I applied for the job, I had gotten a minor in economics in college, and the editor of the paper said, "Okay, you're on the finance page." And so I really hadn't thought that much about financial reporting. And so that was my first gig, was covering finance in Mexico City in the '90s, which turned out to be a great crash course in global economics and global trade flows and capital flows. And then I moved to New York City in 1998, and actually, kind of similar to Chris, what you're doing now, I got into the trades. I got into worked for financial trades for a few years in New York City. And while I was doing that, I was getting more and more bored with the topic and more into food. And I joined a community garden in Brooklyn. And my partner, not my wife, she was professionally connected to Brooklyn's community, actually New York City's community garden. So I got this view into this side of food politics I hadn't thought before. This was when Mayor Giuliani decided, who was then mayor of New York, decided that he was going to bulldoze the city's gardens, which were, a lot of them were run by African American and Puerto Rican folks. And it became this sort of major movement that I just sort of got embroiled in. And it was sort of a crash course in food politics. And it turned out my partner, Alice Wilson, her family has a farm in Western North Carolina. And to make a really long story short, we ended up moving to the farm and taking it over and starting to experiment and with different ways of making the small vegetable farm work. And I kept my finance job remotely, and then ended up not losing the job essentially. And but I had this discipline to write every day. I was turning out a financial newsletter, and I transferred that skill and discipline. I launched a free food politics blog. It was basically, suddenly I was doing this thing I was interested in and had all these ideas about writing about it. I had no connections in food media. My only connections were in finance media. And so I started a free blog. This is like the first great iteration of blogs, like 2003, 2004. And after doing that for a while, I got on Grist. I remember Grist said, "Hey, why don't you move your blog here?" And I said, "Okay, well, how much are you going to pay me?" And they said, "We're not going to pay you anything." But and at first I was insulted, and then I was like, "Wait a minute! I've got something like 40 readers on my blog, and if I move to, and I'm not making anything off of it, and if I move to Grist, I'll have many times more readers, and I still won't be making anything off of it. But that actually is better for me." And I ended up getting on first half-time and then full-time, and then moving to Mother Jones. But that's sort of how I got into, and so my first, 6 or 7 years on this particular beat, I was, from the ground on a small farm in North Carolina that was trying to make a go of it. And, taught me a lot of lessons in sort of small farm economics, some of the challenges that we face, some of the opportunities and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear all of you talk about how your route to your beat was a little bit circuitous, as you said, Tom. Because I even for me, it's fascinating to hear how these people that I've read your stuff and, I follow your careers and how you got to where you are. And I think that a lot of journalists, sometimes it's a straight line, but it doesn't always have to be.
Very much so.
Yeah. So my next question is, what food and agriculture issues are you paying attention to right now? And what do you think other journalists interested in food and ag, writing about food and ag, what should they be paying attention to? And I'll invite any of you to jump in unless I need to call names.
Well, I'll go ahead. Uh, I pay a lot of attention to the Farm Bill, and that I primarily a quote policy reporter. So that's probably my biggest focus right now is listening to the debates and discussion about what lawmakers are asking questions about from USDA and from people in agriculture, the SNAP debate, things of that nature. But I've also been spending, as much time as I can focusing on USDA's new attention to climate smart agriculture, and where does USDA go with that, and how do commodity farmers and livestock producers embrace that? Do they see that moving forward? And do we move the needle on, agriculture and its environmental issues through the focus on these practices? So that's probably where I've been spending, the vast majority of my attention over the last several months. And by the way, I was, envious of Tom, because when I grew up, I remember the first time I saw Mother Jones on a magazine rack, and I read Mother Jones very heavily when I was younger. So very envious that when he was writing for them, because I was just always a big fan of Mother Jones when I was a kid. They were definitely, one of the most hard-hitting publications out there when I was just beginning to learn about what journalism was about.
Well, let me just interject that I have been reading, Chris, I've been reading your byline for as long as I've been on this beat. I haunt the trade publications whenever I can get in without a password, and you just do fantastic work on a day-to-day basis. Just wanted to get that in there. I've seen
Well, thank you.
byline literally probably 1,000 times at least.
Claire, what are you working on?
Well, recently I've been spending a lot of time on some longer term projects. I think some topics that I've been paying attention to recently are some of the labor movements happening in agriculture. There are a lot of farm workers right now who are organizing around, getting better overtime pay. I mean, that was huge this past year in Oregon, and that bill actually was passed. So farm workers can now qualify for overtime pay. That was not a guarantee beforehand. And, that has been actually a source of controversy for a lot of farmers who are taking on more costs as they try to figure out how they're going to pay for this. So it's been interesting seeing kind of the different perspectives and debates on that topic. But I mean, I've also been spending a lot of time learning about the poultry industry. And speaking of labor movements within that, there's been a lot of issues related to really fast line speeds. And there's been some poultry plants who are the United Food and Commercial Workers Union represents them. And there's, a lawsuit against the USDA right now for this extremely fast line speed rate of 175 birds per minute, which means workers are processing like 1 to 2 birds every 2 seconds. Like, it's a really absurd amount. So I think that's something, those are stories that I'm really interested in both learning about and trying to tell. I think it can be challenging, telling farm worker stories in a way that's appropriate, because a lot of the time it's also really hard to even get an interview with a farm worker because there's fear of retaliation from your employer. So I think I've been thinking about that a lot, and I don't have a perfect answer to how do you cover those stories in ways that are sensitive and don't put people at risk, and don't know, tell the full story of what it's like to actually be working in these facilities night and day. It's a ton of work, and I think it's really important to remember when reporting in agriculture.
Yeah, I think all of those are excellent topics. It's such a broad area, as some of you have, I mean, illustrated by the list here. Chris, I heard you mention the Farm Bill, and actually, sorry, I'll take one second to say I see there's a question in the chat, and we'll definitely answer that in our questions portion. So you all should feel free, if something occurs to you, to drop it in the chat, or I see some ideas for other reporting, that other issues that would be excellent to be covered. So don't feel like you can't use the chat. We'll go through a few questions here, and then we'll turn to yours. But this is all to say, Chris, I heard you mention the Farm Bill, which is one of the things that comes to mind for me when I think of, oh gosh, what should we be looking at in this realm? And so I'd love, if you're able, or if you want to, for you to expand on that a little bit. Are there certain sections of it, or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, right now it's always a grind, because if you're trying to pay attention to the agriculture committees, and before COVID, I would be out in DC at least every month. Out there. I haven't gone out there nearly as much lately, but get out there from time to time. Be back out there in April for a few days, but I spend a lot of time just kind of watching and listening to the hearings and what's being talked about and what's being asked about, and fortunately, the committees, most of the time, the House and Senate Ag Committee, when they have a hearing, they'll have it on a particular topic, so the people coming in, um, too often, though, of course, most everybody testifying is somebody from one of the DC lobby organizations, but you can catch and listen to, if they have a listening session out in the countryside, what are the people asking about with that? What are the asks? The Farm Bill is a very complicated thing because it's a pie full of money, and the committees are trying to figure out how to split up that money. And only once do I ever recall anybody ever going to into the Farm Bill saying, hey, we're good, we don't need any more money, in fact, you can go ahead and cut us. That was the cotton guys who did that one time, and they found out very shortly after they did that what a terrible mistake they had made, and they spent the next 3 or 4 years trying to figure out how to get themselves back into the Farm Bill commodities, because so nobody ever you know needs or wants less money. But there are some areas, this week there be some focus on the research title, for instance. Incredibly underfunded. There are a lot of things that are going on in agriculture that could use more research funding. Just simply even something as complicated as avian influenza that's been hitting poultry operations over the past year. There's a laundry list there. It's difficult to talk about cutting edge research at universities where they're working in buildings that are 60 years old, and have leaky roofs and bad heating and ventilation, and yet they're trying to do top of the line research, so to speak, with their students. So there's just a lot of things right there. But more or less, just at the moment, just trying to listen to what are people most interested in, and what are we trying to focus on and protect the cuts. They always talk about trying to make some changes to the SNAP program because, on one hand, they'll tell you, we're going to be spending $1.2 trillion on SNAP. On the other hand, when you really break it down, the average SNAP recipient receives like $6 a day. It's extraordinarily difficult for anybody to provide a quality life of eating food on $6 or $7 a day. But those are just really a few of the issues that get touched upon with the Farm Bill. Rural development is extraordinarily important for all of these communities across the country. The energy title, which kind of ties into rural development, because if you're talking about wind or solar expansion, all of the energy programs that they have at USDA as well, all of these different things get touched upon. Even rural housing, which I know is a huge, complicated problem in a lot of Western states or other parts of the country now. USDA is, one of the biggest home lenders in the country, so they're just all of these different aspects get tied into this one piece of legislation. And then something always comes out of it going, man, I totally missed that. I didn't see that in the bill. There's just so much stuff that happens in it. And then you find out after the fact, I missed that. So it's hard to cover it all.
Yeah, I'm always struck again and again by the massiveness of the Farm Bill and how much it contains. And I remember realizing that SNAP was part of it a couple of years ago and going, oh yeah, wow, this is really important. Not that the other stuff isn't, but it's kind of amazing. So I know lots of us will be keeping eyes on that. And Claire and Tom, I certainly don't want to bowl over you here. If you have anything to interject, feel free. Otherwise, I can go on to the next question. And I see, again, questions piling up here in the chat, so know that I see them. One of the things that we do here at the Daily Yonder that we really put emphasis on is sort of complicating these narratives about rural communities. A lot of the time, and Claire alluded to this a little bit in one of her previous answers, a lot of the time people will think rural and automatically think farming. And that's certainly not wrong, but it's also not totally correct, right? There are lots of other types of counties, recreation, manufacturing, these sorts of things that happen in rural. And also, one of the things that I've seen is folks saying farming and thinking barns and cows. And I know farming is a lot bigger a topic than, just sort of the stereotypes. So I'm curious about what stereotypes or assumptions you all have seen within this beat and how perhaps journalists can avoid falling into these traps.
I think this is a great question. And it's a question that I've been thinking a lot about recently. And I think that one of the things that we don't think as much about when it comes to industrial agriculture, the sort of industrialization that we saw like in the second half of the 20th century into today, is that there has been this tremendous drop in the number of farms and farmers. And so the conflation of rural and agriculture is getting more and more untrue. These are not rural areas, and agriculture as a business are becoming delinked. And just as an example, the number of you think about the most farm intensive state in the country is probably Iowa. Most of Iowa is under agriculture. So you think about it as this farm intensive state, and if you're a candidate running for office, for president, and you're having your primary there, and you go to Iowa, you definitely want to go to a farm and get around some bales of hay, maybe get a hay seed in your mouth, and, have a tractor behind you and things like that. but it's really important to note that Iowa, there are 85,000 farms in Iowa, essentially. It means 85,000 farmers or so. Now, farm families, to say there's four, maybe multiply that number by a few because farm families, but the population of Iowa is, something like 3.2 million. So even in Iowa, the number of, let's say if you're this theoretical politician going there, the number of actual farmers who are voting ends up being a very, very tiny number. And that is because essentially industrial agriculture has driven most farmers out of business. And that's why, another reason why you see, small towns in a place like Iowa in decline. Not all of them for sure, but you see this happen. And you see it in other areas too. Like I'm doing some work in Eastern North Carolina for a couple of different projects. And, this is an area that is very agricultural. It's, a few counties there are, Duplin County, Sampson County are the most hog intensive counties in the United States, some of the most hog intensive counties in the world, regions in the world. And the actual number of, working farmers there is tiny. And what you get is a community affected by what the farmers are up to, but not that many farmers. And I think this is a really important perspective for journalists to take into consideration. And, there's lots of great research, like if you look at Iowa and ethanol production, so there's this idea, if you're a politician who's going to Iowa, you got to say, well, I support, the federal ethanol mandates. And there's this mythology that it's this big jobs provider, but there's this fantastic economist at Iowa State University who's recently retired, Dave Swenson, who has done studies showing that the number of jobs provided by the ethanol industry is actually vanishingly tiny. These are essentially like breweries that are run without a whole lot of labor. So it's not a very labor-intensive industry. And I think having especially national non-agricultural journalists to understand that, I think would make a big difference, that these communities are not necessarily, they're surrounded by farms, but they're less and less agricultural communities. So I guess that would be my quick 2 cents on that.
Yeah, that's great. Claire, I know you think a lot about this in our work at the Daily Yonder. I'm curious what you have to say.
Yeah, no, I appreciate everything that you just said, Tom. I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions that I do see in these rural caricatures, where it is, right, the farmer with the hay in the mouth. Like that's not true to what the majority of rural America actually is. And I think, to your point, there's a lot of the effects of these farms because, right, there are far fewer people who are farmers, who are employed by farmers as there used to be. I think what I've been interested in is looking at sort of the side effects of living near some of these larger agricultural operations. I've been doing some work in Eastern Oregon where there's been a lot of nitrate pollution in the rural wells because of the farms in that region. And it's affecting not just people who work on those farms, but huge communities. So it's been interesting to think about how agriculture, while it may not employ or represent as many people in rural America as it used to, I think it does still have a large impact on communities that are located in those regions. So it's interesting trying to find that balance between telling the rural story that does include agriculture, but then also giving a critical look at some of those negative effects that these larger corporations have had on small rural communities. It's a tricky issue, and it's one that's different in whatever region you're in. And as Caroline, you mentioned, there are also a lot of rural regions where there isn't any farming or very little farming. So rural America is not this monolith. And it is funny when you see a campaign advertisement for a politician where they're wandering through a field or something that's really only, perhaps relatable to a very small portion of their voter base. So I think rural America it's not this just swath of farmers as some people, especially people who live in suburban and urban America, often think.
Yeah, I think that tension between less people farming and still the influence of agriculture is a really interesting one. The massive influence of agriculture is a really interesting one to keep in mind. And of course, that is due to the industrialization and all of the stuff we've mentioned. Chris, I don't know if you have anything to add about pitfalls, but I welcome your thoughts.
Well, you've got so many different dynamics at play. I mean, we when you talk about large agriculture, and who owns the land? Um, in Nebraska, the two largest landowners in Nebraska, individuals, are Bill Gates and Ted Turner. Neither one of them actually live in Nebraska. They're the two large. Ted Turner is the biggest single rancher, quote, in the state of Nebraska. I think the Mormon Church might be number two, or they're competing with each other there. And then as far as farmland, it's Bill Gates, and I think in a couple of other states, it's Bill Gates. You have consolidation going on of these landowners, and then so you have in a lot of states, you have a high percentage of farmers are renting the land. They're not the owners, and maybe they don't even will never have the opportunity to own the ground that they're renting at the moment. And that's a growing challenge that you see among farmers or among people trying to get into farming. But agriculture is changing so much in different ways. Vertical farming, quote, in warehouses, urban agriculture in different ways. I really, I went down, I didn't have anything to do a couple of weeks ago. I had to stay around the DC area. So I went down to Richmond for the weekend, and surprisingly, Richmond had farmers markets opened on Saturday, and I went around and visited with some guys. I was surprised all of these guys were full-time farmers, all had very small operations. Some of them, there was one guy who was literally growing microgreens in an apartment bedroom, basically, and also working with a community garden, and he was doing that full time. I was kind of blown away by all these different guys who were, quote, full-time farmers, but didn't fit the definition of what I would typically call a full-time farmer. But that's their full-time job. That's what they're doing. They're selling direct to consumers, and they don't want 1,000 acres or 500 acres. They want 2 acres or 5 acres to be able to own. It was interesting writing that piece, because it was a little eye-opening for me. Just again, I just went down to Richmond for a weekend and came across these guys, and opened my eyes a little bit to that there is a more diverse urban ag out there that maybe I haven't been paying much attention to. And as far as rural, and rural issues beyond agriculture, I did want to make a plug that the Daily Yonder, I think, does a really good job, and they did this really well as the pandemic was going on, of covering rural healthcare. And very undercovered topic, but affects obviously everybody in rural areas. And that's an area that does not get nearly as much attention But I thought particularly as during the pandemic, as I was looking at your guys' coverage, you guys were doing an excellent job of looking at the different issues going on with rural healthcare, and that's an area that I should probably be doing a little more. We should probably be doing a little more focus on that as well. But just wanted to mention that real quick.
Yeah, I think healthcare and especially small farming is a huge topic, and also healthcare in rural areas in general. And I agree with Chris that Daily Yonder's done a great job with that. And one more thing I want to throw in there to complicate, not present company accepted, Daily Yonder is not guilty of this at all. But I think on the national level, a lot of journalists are guilty of kind of conflating rural with white. This idea that rural areas are white areas, rural areas are Trump country area or whatever. And actually it's a lot more complicated than that. Like I said, I've been in Eastern North Carolina, and it's certainly no coincidence that where the hog industry and increasingly the poultry industry now has decided to alight are the most heavily African American counties of North Carolina. And so when you talk to rural people in Eastern North Carolina, you're largely talking to African Americans, Latinos who are moving in to work on these operations. It is not a very white area, and this is true in so many places. Like I'm thinking about when I was doing research on my book, and I spent a couple of months in Iowa, going to visit Storm Lake, Iowa, which is one of the most vibrant small towns in Iowa because it's got a giant Tyson meatpacking plant, largely staffed by Latinos, and so you actually see a local economy of tiendas and little Mexican restaurants and things like mom and pop restaurants to serve that population, and it completely breaks the stereotype of Iowa suburbs. Iowa rural areas as lily white. Same in the Central Valley of California, obviously, massive rural area, very agricultural, and also heavily Latino. And I think that's something that we, as journalists, really have to get away from and dive more into the diversity and the issues around that diversity in rural America.
Yeah, I appreciate so much all of those points. You all, they're really important. And, I also appreciate your kudos to the Daily Yonder. We are doing what we can here. So, it's good to know we're on the right track. I think I'm going to head over to the chat here because I see questions continuing to come in, and we'll address them as we're able. Bob writes that he's wondering if anyone could offer comment on the current activities of the North American Agricultural Journalist Association. Do they as a group bring forward topics of concern to rural activists? I'm not super familiar with this group. I don't know if any of you all are.
Yeah, I'm kind of deeply entrenched with NAJ. You got a couple of ag journalism organizations in the U.S. You've got North American Agricultural. We're a very small group, and we also we remain small because we also refuse to take any sponsorship money of any type. So that really limits us. We have a meeting once a year in DC, and we have a writing contest. Most of our discussions are amongst each other in terms of reaching out in what would you say, educational or that sort of things. And we were a little dormant for a while there during COVID, and lost an executive director who retired. So we're trying to rebuild that group a little bit. We're pretty thin. There's another organization called the Ag Communicators Network, which is a much larger group. And it includes both agricultural journalists and also people involved in public relations around agriculture. And but what you mentioned in terms of bringing forward topics of concern of rural activists, neither one of those organizations really focuses on advocacy. It's not really, their role or function as journalist organizations. So they really probably don't pay as much attention to to being advocates, so to speak. We do try to connect with as many people as possible and look at different issues. We've done some work, I know, with NAJ in terms of connecting with Black farmers and trying to understand, a topic called heirs property, and understanding just how that affects them. But that's really about it.
Thanks, Chris. Bob, I hope that helps a little bit. A question from James says, what's your advice to high school and college students seeking future employment with ag and farm publications or organizations? And I guess we all sort of covered backgrounds, but if you have any specific advice, James would love to hear it. Hi, James.
Claire, how did you get involved? Why don't you tell us your thoughts here?
I truly actually have a lot of thoughts about this. I really don't think you need to go to school for journalism. I think it is helpful. It's very helpful taking a journalism class. I took one journalism class and it absolutely transformed my life. In ways I had no idea what I read articles, but for some reason, trying to write them, it was so much harder. But with someone to actually, a professor is actually very helpful in that regard. But I don't necessarily think you need a degree in journalism to enter this industry. I think a lot of the time, it's really helpful to figure out how to pitch a place, which I didn't learn that from my journalism class. Unfortunately, that was one of its flaws, and it's a lot of trial and error. But as a high school and college student, I think younger people are often more likely to sort of underwrite their qualifications, or say, I'm just a student, but I would love to help out. I don't think you should, I don't think you should worry too much about being young if you're trying to enter this industry, because you learn so much in, the conversations that you have with people. So I guess my recommendation is, if there's a publication that you admire, finding a contact, usually with one of the editors, is the best place to start. And although the first place to start, though, is making sure you have an idea. And from there, I think then doors can maybe open. But it is really challenging. I don't want to say that it's easy by any means, but I don't think you need to have a formalized journalism education to get into it. I think you just need to have an idea for a story, and then read the publications, see what place it could fit, and then reach out to an editor, and you might be surprised. Really, that's what happened to me. I pitched to Native News Online, which is a really fantastic online publication that focuses on Indigenous reporting. And they were so kind to me, and published my first piece that was ever published, and actually paid me for it. And it was amazing. And that alone was extremely validating. So I don't know, I have a lot of opinions on what editors should be doing to really encourage maybe first-time reporters. But I don't be intimidated, I guess, and keep trying, because there will be a lot of failures. Hopefully that makes sense.
Claire, let's talk later. Well, the chat is fast and furious here. Chris Bob wrote to say thank you for your response. I'm scrolling back up. James, you had another question. No pressure at all here, but I'll invite you to unmute if you'd like to ask it yourself.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Mhm.
Well, first of all, I don't even know how I learned about this Zoom conference call today. I'm so glad I did because it's been very, very interesting. I've been communicating with at least one of the others on the call today about backgrounds, but some of us have been around a long time. Remember President Jimmy Carter, remember Bob Berglund, who was the Secretary of Agriculture back then. And he brought up the topic, which I don't think a lot of people had thought about, or at least publicly thought about, was the structure of agriculture. Not only looking at farming as one monolith of everyone being the same, which it is not, but focusing on size of operations, concentration agriculture, all those kinds of things. And I just read an article today in Successful Farming, I put the link in the chat, saying that Ag Secretary Vilsack is kind of bringing up some of those similar concepts right now for the next farm bill. And I'm interested as sort of as historical. I think maybe some people care more than others about that. You know, as long as we have enough food total, that's maybe all that some people care about, you know, production only and efficiency and productivity. But should we worry and care about the structure of size of operations, diversity, all those kinds of things? So that's a big question, but I would be interested in some comments.
But you often see the pendulum swing from Ag Secretary to Ag Secretary. You know, as you mentioned, what Vilsack was saying, Sonny Perdue, who came before him, you know, told everybody they need to get bigger. You know, so he kind of, what was it? Earl Butz was the secretary under Nixon, who said, you know, farm fence row to fence row and get bigger. And then Sonny was talking to dairy farmers who were really struggling in Wisconsin, I think it was, when he made that kind of comment. And he got some pushback from that, but you see that kind of swing from administration to administration on that. Vilsack is trying to shape the ag committees into putting more thought into into investing more in rural development and putting more into programs that can help more smaller and beginning farmers in different ways, and not just you know, your funding that you have for your commodity titles. And so he's kind of kicked off that stump speech that that you mentioned about 2-3 months ago, and he's been refining it ever since. You know, he talked to the Senate Agriculture Committee last week about some of these issues, and got some pushback from some of the particularly Republican members of the Senate who you know, continued to say, don't forget about, you know, the production agriculture. So it's a focus of his, definitely, that he's had for a long time. And I think the pandemic shaped some of that somewhat, because, you know, we saw how, you know, an efficient supply chain can break down pretty easily. And once it breaks down, you know, it becomes more, you know, complicated. We had, you know, dairies, because schools weren't in session, because institutions were closed. We didn't know, dairy farmers didn't have a way to sell their milk, because they were used to selling their milk, you know, that went into large volumes rather than in gallon jugs that go into grocery stores. You know, we didn't have the capacity. It wasn't just milk; it was other products as well. So they've been spending a lot of money at USDA to support smaller processing, smaller food facilities, regional food systems. And, you know, it'll take time, I think, to see how some of that stuff develops.
Thanks,
Hope
Chris.
that answers what your question.
James says thumbs up. Like I said, still fast and furious in the chat here. I apologize if we can't quite get to your question, or if I skip over it, and I will assure all of you that after a few more questions here, we're going to open it up to jump into breakout rooms so that you can chat amongst yourselves if you're keen on that, because I see some awesome conversation and chatter going on here. So never fear. Ellen is wondering about covering organic, regenerative, and biodynamic agriculture and how that sort of fits into journalism. Should it be advocacy? You know, I know it's a very complicated issue. I come from a farming community that's heavily organic, but that's not to say that it's always the solution, right? It's a really complex issue. So I'm curious if any of you have done any reporting on that, or if you have thoughts.
You know, as a farmer, when I did farm, I was also in that tradition, that style, and I think it is really important to cover. And I think that one of the big issues now, I think, with the phrase regenerative is that it is very important concept, but it's not been defined by any, you know, there's no USDA regenerative label. I guess there is now. Someone is pointing out in the chat, I think this is correct, that there is this is Ellen saying there's an organic regenerative label, and that's true. But it is something that a lot of companies that are involved in the sort of status quo of agriculture are jumping in. And, you know, it would be very convenient if you could get the sort of current farming system labeled regenerative, if you could just add a couple of tweaks to it and call it regenerative, and the concept would become another way to maintain the status quo. And so I think it's very important that we as journalists cover it critically, and, you know, see, you know, where your sort of General Mills and these kinds of companies are coming from, what their goals are, you know, how much they really intend to change their sourcing, to change the you know, sort of cropping patterns that they're supporting, and things like that. You know, I also think that that there has been an effort by the industry, by, you know, sort of the food industry, to, when it's not sort of trying to co-opt things with, you know, by claiming the label regenerative, there's this idea that organic farming, or sort of, you know, getting out of the sort of chemical monocrop system, is somehow elitist. And I think it's really important to push back on that, you know, what's elitist, I think, is to have communities in Eastern North Carolina that are considered sacrifice zones, that are being treated as sacrifice zones. That's really elitist meat. It's not sort of pasture-raised meat. I think that's a really amazing reversal that the industry has been able to achieve. And so these are just my initial thoughts, and you know, how I covered it in, you know, my 15 or so years in the beat, and how I think you know, I think people should think about these ideas going forward, of, you know, just covering it really critically, looking at the next big thing askance, looking at it you know, very, very critically. I think, you know, something else that I think we're going to be seeing is carbon credits in agriculture. And I think this is a topic that that the science is pretty hazy on, and that, you know, it could work in a way that moves us to cutting greenhouse gas emissions, or it could work in a way that, you know, gets people paid for the status quo, to maintain the status quo, and keeps us on this spiral towards climate chaos. And so those are my initial thoughts on this, and I'll cede the floor.
That's great, Tom. Thank you. I think that point about, elitism and regenerative and pasture raised is something that I think about a lot, and it's just an interesting tension of how our food has been grown and how it has come sort of full circle in this odd way. This last question that I'm going to pose here before we head to breakout rooms, I'm going to throw the baton to Claire first, because I know that she's written about this recently. Sherry is wondering in the chat, is there any talk anywhere of reducing the influence of big ag companies like Cargill, ADM, JBS? And do you think that will ever happen? And I'm thinking of you, Claire, because I know you've been looking at eggs and accusations of price gouging in the egg industry, given that prices have been so high. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about this.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there have been a lot of efforts over the past few years, especially during the COVID pandemic, from the Biden administration to actually throw some money toward building up smaller or regional agriculture operations. So I think there's definitely been a lot of talk. I mean, off the top of my head, there's been a few bills proposed recently. Senator Cory Booker has been on a lot of those bills to try to support like smaller meat packing operations. There's a ton of advocacy coming from grassroots organizations related to breaking up some of these monopolies that we're seeing in not just meat, but eggs. There are a ton of places where this is occurring, pretty much every place, I would say, in agriculture to some degree. And I think it really is possible. Right now there are these huge, really powerful and rich companies who are able to control the way agriculture runs in this country right now. But I think that there have been some shows from both at the federal level, but I think most promisingly at these local levels with organizations who are, creating grant programs for beginning farmers and ranchers, creating outreach programs that try to encourage people who are new to agriculture to actually come into this industry and disrupt it a little bit. It's not something that I think will happen probably all at once across the country, but I think at these local levels, there is a lot of promising work. In Montana, where I lived for a few years, there was some really great organizations who are encouraging beginning farmers and ranchers to get into the industry and providing them money to do so. So I think that, that is on the horizon. I don't know when though, and I don't know if Chris or Tom, you have thoughts on this, but I think it is more hopeful than it's some.
Yeah, go ahead if either of you have thoughts.
Just real briefly, the Biden administration did appoint some very anti-consolidation people to some very key posts. I think the most famous being Lena Khan, who is the head of the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. And I feel like I remember covering it for Mother Jones a while back, that even Vilsack, who, let's just say he wants, to get back to Chris's answer, he does want multiple scales of agriculture to work, but he's not anti-big ag at all. Kind of work in big ag in between his two secretary stints. But Vilsack, got someone in a key post, forgetting his name, who is also very much into competition, anti-consolidation. So within the USDA, there's someone like that. And so I think, probably this administration has been the most anti-consolidation administration that we've had in a very, very long time, at least since before President Reagan. And how that translates and what sort of competition title gets into the Farm Bill, I think is anyone's guess.
Billy. Well, thank you all three of you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. I'm told that there will be options for breakout rooms to choose your favorite color for which one you want to join, and then that, you know, can start a conversation if you're a team blue person or a team green person, whatever you prefer. One of my colleagues here is running the Zoom, and so in 1 second, she'll turn on the levers in terms of breakout rooms. Panelists, you're welcome to join one if you like, but no pressure on that front either. This is just an opportunity for our audience to engage with one another the same way that you all have been doing so eagerly in the chat, and it's really great to see. We're so grateful to all of you for coming to hang out. And if you're not interested in joining a breakout discussion, no problem either. You can sign off now. We'll be emailing, you know, all of you with a thanks for joining, and you know, you can get on the list for the next conversation. So thank you so much for joining us for this panel, and we hope to see you again soon.